More than money. Why poverty is more complex than just income.
Most people have probably never taken the time to think about what it actually means to be poor. Sure, there are many qualitative characteristics that people associate with poverty, such as not having a sufficient income, being homeless, or being hungry. But with so many factors, what does it actually mean to be poor?
Well, it is quite subjective as poverty is a complex thing to describe. No one has a perfect answer, but what would be the best way to describe poverty given the data that we are able to collect in today's society? Poverty should be defined based on factors relative to the social standing of others, such as education, life expectancy, income, standard of living, and other basic capabilities. Poverty should be derived by using a quasi-relative form of measurement that considers capabilities and is easily comparable to one's environment.
Many would say that not having the basic means to survive is how our society should measure poverty. The official way the US measures poverty is known as the OPM, or the official poverty measure. This is the poverty measure that most people are familiar with due to how easy it is to measure. The OPM is calculated by taking the lowest income needed to purchase the basic amount of food needed to survive, then it is multiplied by 3 because low-income families spend a third of their income on food. It is an absolute measure, meaning the poverty line is unchanging throughout the years.
An absolute measure of poverty has its convenient benefits, which is the reason why our official poverty measure in the US is absolute. You are able to track absolute measures easily to see long-term trends. They are also easier to calculate than other forms of measurement. Unfortunately, the convenience of absolute measure has a cost. Absolute measures fail to capture important characteristics and factors such as inequality, capabilities, and utilities. For example, the OPM does not include medical out-of-pocket expenses and in-kind benefits such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or Earned Income Tax Credit.
So why do we use a measurement like the OPM if it has all of these glaring flaws? Much of the blame can fall under the fallacy of measurement, which explains why a certain system is easy to calculate, thus people become convinced that the system is the best measurement. This, however, is not the case. There are much more relevant ways to measure poverty that are more telling of the true conditions of people with lower incomes.
As opposed to poverty being defined by having basic human needs met, others believe that poverty should be used as a relative term. Absolute measures of poverty do not consider the changing environment or the relativity of one's well-being to others in society. Using a relative measure of poverty can fix this problem as it describes one's poverty based on the norm of society. Take a country where there is a high level of income inequality, for example. An absolute poverty measure would be blind to this inequality as it is unaffected by ranges.
A relative poverty measure, however, would be able to showcase the inequality because the poverty threshold is calculated based on a chosen percentile in the population. If the government chooses to set the threshold at the 30th percentile, the poverty threshold may be set at $20,000. If the GDP per capita increases, the 30th percentile would increase to, let's say, $25,000. The economy overall improved and the standard for being in poverty increased. Perfect for measuring poverty? Not quite. It may seem that way, but a simple relative poverty measure may be just as flawed or even more flawed than an absolute measure.
Just as absolute forms of measure, relative measures do not capture in-kind benefits. The biggest dilemma this form of measure faces is when a country has a roughly homogeneous income amongst its people. This dilemma can be illustrated through the example of Qatar. Today, Qatar has the second highest GDP per capita in the world. Using a relative measurement of poverty, we would fail to recognize what it actually means to be poor in Qatar. Society's expectations of poverty would be vastly different from poverty in Qatar since the poor of Qatar would be amongst the wealthiest in much poorer countries such as India and Uganda. The reverse of this situation would produce the same result. Using a relative poverty measure for extremely poor countries such as Uganda would mislead people to think that people who are just above the poverty threshold are well off, when in fact they would be considered poor in most other countries. Relative forms of measurement simply do not use enough data to accurately describe poverty.
There is an alternative to both absolute and relative measurements of poverty that many would argue to be better, known as a quasi-relative measurement. This form of measurement focuses primarily on factoring in capabilities. Martha Nussbaum, a major author on poverty, wrote in her book Creating Capabilities, The Human Development Approach, that capabilities are used to emphasize that the most important elements of people's quality of life are plural and qualitatively distinct. She also explained that health, bodily integrity, education, and other aspects of individual lives cannot be reduced to a single metric without distortion. Poverty experts such as Nussbaum have divided capabilities into three major sections: internal capabilities, combined capabilities, and basic capabilities.
Internal capabilities consist of the characteristics and traits of a person. These characteristics help to train and develop personal traits in order to better human development. An example is when an individual has the ability to speak internally, yet their speech is repressed publicly. In comparison, combined capabilities are the available opportunities that an individual has for choice and action in a specific political, social, or economic environment. People have internal capabilities but are oftentimes blocked by society. For example, a child may be incredibly intelligent, but if the child lives in a poor community where there is not a reliable school system in place, the child may not be able to reach their full potential. The third type of capability that Nussbaum describes in her book is basic capabilities. She defines these capabilities as entitlements that people are born with, of which later make development and training possible. The 10 she mentions are as follows: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, sense, imagination, and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. If you believe that people have the right to these capabilities, then it is logical to consider them for the measurement of poverty.
One popular quasi-relative poverty measure that considers capabilities is the Human Development Index, or HDI. The HDI emphasizes the importance of factors such as education and life expectancy. Measure of America of the Social Science Research Council clarifies that the HDI is an easy-to-understand numerical measure made up of what most people believe are the very basic ingredients of human well-being.
Alternatively, there is the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM, which is useful in the way that it includes non-traditional households and in-kind benefits. In-kind benefits include supplemental nutrition assistance programs, temporary assistance for needy families, earned income tax credit, and subsidized housing. Additionally, the SPM deducts childcare, taxes, medical out-of-pocket expenses, and work-related and transportation costs. The SPM threshold is calculated by taking one-third of the median of expenditures of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, and by adding a fractional amount for personal items. It is then adjusted for 9 geographical regions.
Despite some of the flaws of the SPM and HDI, they are substantially more accurate representations of poverty than absolute or relative measures. The ideal poverty measure is a combination of both quasi-relative measurements. The HDI offers a reliable tracking of education, life expectancy, and standard of living, while the SPM is proficient in gaining an accurate understanding of necessary expenses such as food, clothing, and utilities. Combining the two would satisfy the importance of basic capabilities and unavoidable and unexpected costs.
Nonetheless, poverty is a complex byproduct of our social, political, and economic structures. Although it can be difficult to measure due to its multifaceted nature, it is critical to include capability and relativity towards various environments when defining poverty.